month, President Trump signed what he called a national security presidential memorandum, which declared that extended swaths of 3 contiguous states are all now technically a military base. It's 170 miles long, a long strip of federal land along the southern borders of California, Arizona, and New Mexico. And in this memo, Trump ordered the Pentagon, the Defense Department, to start taking control of this land. So now the U.S. military has taken control of 170 miles of land, starting in New Mexico, along New Mexico's southern border. And they've declared that that land is now part of Fort Huachuca, which is a U.S. Army base that's not even in New Mexico. It's in Arizona. Why would you take 170 miles of land in 3 different states and say all that land is now part of an Army base somewhere very far away? Well, the reason Trump is doing that is because he wants active duty U.S. military service members to start arresting people on U.S. soil. Last week, the military announced that U.S. soldiers are now authorized to arrest anyone who steps foot on that 170-mile-long strip of land. U.S. soldiers, active duty soldiers, are now newly authorized to search those people. They are authorized to implement crowd control. U.S. active duty troops searching and arresting people on U.S. soil and performing crowd control operations, again, on U.S. soil. And this land, yes, it is along the Mexican border, and migrants crossing the border are the stated targets of this new operation. So we may not think of this as something that matters for broader U.S. politics, or indeed the health of our political system. But if you're looking for big red flags in terms of authoritarian takeover in a democratic rule of law country, when you've got U.S. troops searching and arresting people and doing crowd control on U.S. soil, you're kind of there. Under American law, the Posse Comitatus Act is supposed to prevent the U.S. government from using U.S. soldiers on U.S. soil. Theoretically, if somebody wanders onto a military base, they can be arrested as trespassers on military property. So the idea, I think here, the neat trick that Trump has pulled here is that he's just turned hundreds of miles of American soil into what is technically a military base. And so, hey, presto, that's one neat trick to give the U.S. military the power to search and arrest people on U.S. soil.
This is what he's been doing, right? What he's been doing is finding ways to consolidate power by exploiting potential loopholes in the law. He views it as a cheat code to end democracy in this country, that just declare emergency powers for whatever you want to do. So the tariffs, for example, he's using emergency powers to do it, even though none of his arguments make sense. The idea that the argument was fentanyl originally. We got fentanyl coming from Canada and Mexico, therefore we need to slap a 25% tariff on both of them. Rand Paul actually made this point. He said, what, is Sweden and Monaco, are they also sending fentanyl into this country? Like, what exactly is the emergency? And this is going to go to court, right? And the Trump regime is going to have to make the argument in front of court why this is a legitimate national emergency. And they're going to fail. They're going to fail. Just like with the Alien Enemies Act, which is the rationale they're using to kidnap people and human traffic them, that's going to fail too, because that's only been used in U.S. history when there's been an actual war going on. There is no actual war. He says, we're declaring Venezuelan gangs, we're declaring them terrorists like they're waging a war on us or something. Well, that's already on flimsy legal ground, because historically you would have needed to be at war with the country of Venezuela, not just like a gang contingent from within it. And then furthermore, it fails on factual grounds, because these people that they claim are Venezuelan gangsters are not by any stretch of the imagination. You got, people like Kilmar Abrego Garcia, no criminal record whatsoever. You got people like the guy who had an autism awareness tattoo for his 15-year-old brother who has autism, who he takes care of. They use that tattoo as evidence of being in a gang when it's no such thing. They have Andres, the gay makeup artist, who's 19 years old. He's not in a gang, so it doesn't. At every level, these arguments fall apart. But they are moving at breakneck speed, the regime is, and the courts have to play catch up. And so tricks like this, it's like they do it, they act now, and then they worry about the consequences later. And then, as we've seen, when courts say, hey, you can't do this thing, you can't do that thing, this is unconstitutional, this is illegal, they blow them off.
And right now they're only doing it at the edges, literally the physical edges of our country. But that is how you start. We've got expert advice on this and what this might mean for all of us here next. Stay with us. Donald Trump, quietly, has now declared that on a 170-mile strip of land across 3 different states, active duty U.S. soldiers now have the authority to arrest and search people. Active duty U.S. troops doing that on U.S. soil. Liza Goitein and Joseph Nunn at the Brennan Center for Justice tonight are calling this a slippery slope, saying, quote, if soldiers are allowed to take on domestic policing roles at the border, it may become easier to justify uses of the military in the U.S. interior in the future. Our nation's founders warned against the dangers of an army turned inward, which can all too easily be turned into an instrument of tyranny.
This is exactly like when there were the George Floyd protests and riots. Remember, Trump wanted to invoke the Insurrection Act. The only reason he couldn't is because General Mark Milley basically told him, we're not doing that. And he also said, why can't we shoot the protesters in the leg? Let's shoot the protesters in the leg. But it was the fact that there were some people around him that weren't totally insane sycophants that got us out of that situation. But this time around, that's not the case. This time around, it's all yes men.
Joining us now is Liza Goitein. She's Senior Director of the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program. Ms. Goitein, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Is there anything about this order that authorizes U.S. soldiers to arrest and search people or use crowd control techniques only against non-U.S. citizens, or could these authorities also be used against U.S. citizens?
No, not at all. These authorities can be used against anyone who trespasses on this new military installation. And that installation does span 170 miles of the New Mexico border. But the original memorandum actually authorizes pretty much any federal lands along the southern border to be transferred to the Department of Defense, including a 60-foot strip of land, 60 feet wide, that actually spans about 600 miles along the California, Arizona, and New Mexico border.
When there's no due process, there are no protections and rights for U.S. citizens either. Because the whole idea of proving that you're a U.S. citizen, it happens when there's due process. It happens when there's a hearing. It happens when you get in front of an objective third party like a judge. So the fact that they don't use due process for any of these kidnappings and human traffickings that they're doing, that shows it's already the case there are no rights for Americans either, right? The idea, we're just going to use this to target undocumented immigrant criminals. Well, we know that's not true, and they've already been deported. They deported a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 6-year-old, and the 4-year-old had cancer, and they were American citizens. This is what people need to understand. It never stops. It's the canary in the coal mine idea. They usually, if they're smart enough, they start with an example of somebody who's hard to defend, right? So like if they were more competent, they would have found somebody who committed 17 murders and not only is in a gang, but actually has MS-13 gang tattoos or whatever. And they would have sent that person to El Salvador, right? But they're so fucking stupid and incompetent and fascist that they were just like, I don't know, round up whoever the fuck we want. And these people are totally innocent. They're innocent. I mean, there was a story of a guy, like, I think he was a teenager who was playing with a water gun. ICE thought it was a real gun, arrested him, and he's being shipped to El Salvador. And now, this is my first time hearing about this, right? That they're basically declaring this massive swath of land, 170 miles worth, that's all now a U.S. military base, so anybody can be arrested and we can do whatever we want with you if we arrest you if you're in that zone.
So we are talking about just sort of a massive land grab that's being turned over to the Department of Defense in order to turn violations of immigration law into trespassing on a military installation. And again, I mean, that could apply to anybody who, without authorization, is on these strips of land on the southern border.
Yeah, I mean, I happen to think that the territorial boundaries of the United States extend all the way to the border, not just near them. And so the idea that U.S. soldiers are operating on U.S. soil with policing powers, to me, feels like every red flag in the world is kind of going off for me. I mean, we do have U.S. soldiers deployed to the border sort of all the time, acting in a support role to Customs and Border Protection. But this is a qualitatively different legal authority, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, what is happening here is an attempt to evade the laws passed by Congress and to usurp congressional authority, starting with the Posse Comitatus Act.
That's literally what they've been doing since they got in office this time. They've basically made it so Congress is null and void. Like, it doesn't even exist anymore. Because what do you call it when the world's richest man, Elon Musk, illegally hacks into the treasury, steals everybody's data, deletes whatever government agencies he wants to delete, cuts off things like pediatric cancer research and Meals on Wheels? What do you call that? He has effectively usurped the power of Congress and the president, and he's clearly violating the Impoundment Control Act, where they just decide, even though this money's already been allocated for something, we're just not going to give it, right? That's usurping the power of Congress. And so now this is another way in which they are usurping the power of Congress.
And that law, as you mentioned, normally prohibits federal armed forces from engaging in these core law enforcement activities, things like arrests and searches and detentions. Now, courts have held that the military can provide indirect logistical support to law enforcement. That's what's been happening at the border for the last 20 years. But this is qualitatively different. It steps over that line